economics of the minimum wage and of inequality in America, what role for human capital policies? He has held a number of other prestigious positions, frankly too many to mention, but I'll mention a couple. He served on the board of directors of the MacArthur Foundation, was a senior scientist for the Gallup Organization, a Sloan Fellow in Economics, and a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Alan Krueger received a BS degree with honors from Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations in 1983, an AM in economics from Harvard University in 1985, and his PhD in economics from Harvard University in 1987. Today, he will discuss with us the rise of alternative work assignments in the U.S. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Krueger.
Thank you very much, President Saltz, for that overly generous introduction. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. I have to say I'm a little bit envious of this speaker series. I think we should do something like this at Princeton. I think it's extremely important for students to learn the lecture, to learn the lesson that learning takes place outside of the classroom at universities, because it's going to take place throughout the rest of your career. And in fact, I think that connects a bit with the topic that I'm going to talk about, the growth in alternative work arrangements in the U.S. The U.S. labor market is constantly changing. Not all of the changes are for the good. Some changes are both good and bad. I've been particularly concerned in my research over the years about the polarization of the U.S. labor market and the rise in inequality. And more recently, I've started to work on the growth in non-traditional jobs. What do I mean by non-traditional jobs? Well, a really good example is Uber, being an Uber driver. You're not an employee if you're an Uber driver. You're an independent contractor. You have the freedom to choose your own hours, but you don't have steady work. You don't get benefits from Uber. So for some workers, it's a good development. For others, it's not the best opportunity for them. And we also have to be concerned about the rise in new types of work on existing jobs. Taxi has certainly been disrupted by Uber. Now, taxi jobs are not the best jobs in the world prior to Uber. They tend not to be unionized. They tend to be lower wage, not have many benefits. But one could be concerned about the rise in alternative work affecting the middle-class jobs that we have in the U.S. Now, when I started this project a few years ago, I focused on Uber and other types of gig work, short-term assignments that people often find on the web. And one of the things I discovered along the way is that work is changing in many other ways as well. And although there's been extremely rapid rise in jobs like Uber, which I'll show you, they're starting from a very low base. So as a result, other forms of non-traditional work are actually more important from the standpoint of the workforce as a whole than the gig economy. And what do I include in those other forms of work? Well, freelance workers, someone who is a 1099 worker, that's the tax form that you get if you work as an independent contractor for someone. Self-employment. Temporary help jobs. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, in their category for alternative work, also includes workers who are employees, but they're employees of a contract firm who contracts them out to work somewhere else. So I don't know how it works here at Bloomsburg, but in many colleges throughout the U.S., the people who clean the dorms are not employees of the college or university. They work for a contract firm, and the university contracted with that firm to have the service done. Same for cafeteria workers. Increasingly in the U.S., that's been moving up the occupational distribution. Legal services, public relations, media relations, accounting, payroll. A lot of that now is contracted out when it used to be done in-house. So what I'm going to do in my lecture is describe these trends, talk about changes that are taking place in the labor market, say a little bit about what I think public policy should do to address them, give a little bit of advice, which, free advice, you should take it for what it's worth, but some advice about how you might be able to navigate some of these changes in the labor market throughout your career, and I plan to leave a lot of time for your questions. And I'd encourage you to stay to listen to the question and answer session, even if you don't have questions yourself. So to summarize this talk, there's been very rapid growth in the US over the last decade in non-traditional work arrangements, most importantly in self-employment. Self-employment covers a wide territory, includes independent contractors, independent consultants, freelance workers, freelance photographers, wide range of type of jobs. The Bureau of Labor Statistics does a survey about once a decade called the Contingent Worker Survey, where they collect information on alternative work arrangements. They have not had the funding to do that for over a decade. Last time they were able to do that was 2005. So at the end of 2015, together with Lawrence Katz, who's a professor at Harvard, I conducted that survey. We did it ourselves. We did it together with the RAND Institute, and I'll describe our findings from our research, comparing it to the trends over the recent years. The online gig economy, TaskRabbit, Uber, Lyft, Elance, these jobs have been growing very, very rapidly, but from a very low base. We estimate that less than 1% of the US workforce in any given month is providing services through an online platform. This goes by many names: the gig economy, on-demand economy, digital platform economy, digital matching markets. It's a category which it's sort of, you know it when you see it, but Uber turns out to be a major player in this area. Uber probably accounts for about half of the work that's being done through online platforms. This type of a relationship where someone finds customers through an intermediary is not confined to online work. Old jobs like being an Avon sales lady, and they were typically sales ladies, not salesmen, that's the same conceptual relationship where you have a triangle where the worker is working through an intermediary to find clients, and the intermediary is taking a commission and paying the worker. Turns out there are twice as many workers working offline through an intermediary, like the old taxi dispatch system. You can think of that as the exact same. Most taxi drivers in the US, not all, most taxi drivers are independent contractors. They lease the car, they provide services through a taxi company who dispatches them over two-way radio still, in many cases, to find customers. That is conceptually the same type of arrangement as a computer app doing the same thing. There are twice as many workers who are providing services directly to customers offline as there are online at the moment. But where we've seen really rapid growth, as I mentioned, is in independent contractors and workers who are working through contract firms. And I'll say more about that in a moment. I expect these trends to accelerate in coming years because the reasons that are causing them are in large part technological, and then there are other economic forces that have been causing them to occur, which I don't expect to reverse in the near term. So I think this is a future that we should prepare for more and more. And that raises some very important policy questions. Can we hold back the tide? Can we prevent these changes from taking place? That's what many countries in Europe have been trying to do. Spain outlaws Uber. You can land in Madrid, try to get an Uber car, your app won't work. So one possibility is to say we're not going to allow these types of changes. I think that comes with costs to society because these new services can be much more efficient. I'll show you something on that. And what I've been focused on is how can we try to improve these jobs? How can we make the labor market function better and apply parts of the social compact that protect traditional employees to workers in these emerging sectors? to gig economy workers in particular. Now, it's not just my opinion that these changes are likely to continue. This is a survey that was done over 1,000 executives by the International Chartered Accountant Organization. And in green shows changes that they expect to see more of, and in gray on the left, changes they expect to see less of. What do they expect to see more of? Well, not very surprisingly, automation, mechanization, technology replacing human workers. That's number one. Number two is outsourcing. They expect to see a continuation of the trend towards outsourcing work. They expect to continue to hire more highly skilled workers, and the labor market has, as you know, has been tilted towards more highly skilled workers over the last 30 years in the US. They expect to be hiring more freelance workers in the future. So business executives certainly expect that these trends will continue into the future. For the older people here, one interesting development is these businesses expect to be hiring more semi-retired people. That's not going to help the students much. But I think there's a recognition among business people that demographics are changing, particularly in developed countries, but also in Asia. So companies more and more are going to be required to make use of a wider range of workers. And I think this will also feed into more part-time employment relationships and more arm's length, independent contracting type relationships. I also want to emphasize that it's very difficult to predict where occupational growth will occur. I'll tell you a couple of stories related to that. One story is from the movie The Graduate. Raise your hand if you've actually seen the movie The Graduate. I think maybe you should have a film series where the students come to watch some of the classics. So in the movie The Graduate, Benjamin, a recent graduate of UC Berkeley, is advised to go into the plastics industry. Classic line, one word, plastics. He seems a little befuddled, and he's told there are lots of opportunities in plastics. Well, plastics employment has declined considerably since the movie was made in the 1960s. There are 3 times more workers right now who are working as plastic surgeons than there are working in the plastics industry in the US. And that's in spite of the fact that plastics has actually done reasonably well in terms of employment compared to other manufacturing sectors. So it's very difficult to predict which occupations will grow. I was once on a panel for the National Institutes of Health where our task was to make a forecast whether we're producing enough graduates in biological fields and biomedical fields in particular. And this was around the time that we thought there'd be a lot of demand because of the mapping of the genome. And I went back and I looked at the previous literature on predicting the demand, number of jobs for scientists in various fields, and it was a dismal failure. Even the very best economists in the world had a pretty poor track record in predicting which jobs will grow. This was actually a challenge for me when I worked for President Obama, because he would often say to me, where will the jobs come from? And my response was, the job market is very dynamic. It's often changing. I'm confident that we will continue to have jobs for people in the future. Over the last century, we were worried about automation replacing workers. We have 150 million people working in the US. The nature of the jobs change as technology changes, but so far we've been quite innovative in finding new uses for human labor. And then I told them about a calculation I did, which I've now updated, which is to calculate what % of job growth is occurring in new occupations, new types of jobs. So here's what I did. And this is a brand new calculation. I looked at what occupations are new. So I started with 2000, and I said, what occupations were added in 2000 by the Bureau of Labor Statistics? So they update their occupations every decade. I compared the 1990 occupation codes to 2000, and then I looked at all of the new ones to make sure that they looked like they were really new, that it wasn't that something was split out from another occupation that existed before. And I came up with 35 new occupations: desktop publishers, computer systems administrator, aerobics instructors. Believe it or not, in the 1990s, it was really hard to find an aerobics instructor. And then I did the same thing using the 2010 occupation codes, and I found 19 new occupations: web developer, wind turbine technician, drone operator. Now, some of this is because the government is a little bit slow in recognizing new occupations and adding them. But by and large, I think these are reflecting new developments, even if they weren't brand new as of, say 2000. And these 54 occupations account for 4 to 5% of total employment in the 2000s, but they account for just about half of all net job growth. And that's what this next slide shows you. From 1999 to 2015, about 10.5 million jobs were added. 5 million of those new jobs were in these new occupations. So what does that say? That says that the labor market is constantly evolving. We need to prepare for shifts in occupations. I think universities need to prepare. Our training system, our retraining system needs to help prepare for these changes that are likely to continue into the future. I don't think this period was exceptional. I did the same thing around 2000, looking back at the previous 20 years, and I found that over half of the jobs at that time were in new occupations. Now, when our system works well, it works like it does in this movie. I don't know, here's another more recent movie. Have you seen Hidden Figures? Show of hands. Boy, you give them too much homework. They're not watching enough movies. No, in all seriousness, this is a wonderful movie. It should have won the Academy Award for Best Film. And the movie is about 3 African-American women who lived in Hampton, Virginia, and they worked on the NASA space program, different technical parts of it. That's the actress, Octavia Spencer, but she played the character of Dorothy Vaughan. Dorothy Vaughan was in charge of the computational room. The computational room in 1963 was a large room which had about 100 women who did computations. They did them on an adding machine. NASA, because of the space race, because of competition with the Soviet Union and Sputnik at that time, purchased an IBM computer. The computer replaced all of the jobs of those who were doing the computations by hand. Now, when we look back at it, it's quite amazing that there were such jobs. But I remember when I started in college, not too far from here, at Cornell, there were old computing machines which people used to estimate regressions by calculating, the sum of x times y, the cross products, doing that all by hand. Anyhow, the movie depicts the true life story where Dorothy Vaughan taught herself how to program in Fortran. Then she taught the rest of her department, and they continued to have jobs because the changing technology created demand for new types of skills. And that is an example of the job market working really well, because ultimately, society progresses when we can do more with less, when we have productivity gains, new technology. That requires disruption. Disruption can be very difficult to manage, but in the long run, what raises our living standards is if we can produce more with less. And managing that transition is a real challenge. It's very difficult, I think, for workers to make that type of a transition. And it's particularly difficult for workers to make that type of a transition if they don't plan ahead, and if they're not given some support, if there's not some forethought into, well, where should we invest our resources in retraining? So some general lessons from this, and I think there's some important lessons for both companies, students, and universities. We should be aware that the future is going to be different than the present in terms of the nature of work. It's very hard to know exactly what types of jobs will emerge, which means that we have to be nimble. We have to adapt. And you should think of your careers as involving a set of tasks that are likely to change. And one of the things that education does is it teaches people throughout their careers how to adapt to new environments. I think we could do a better job monitoring what sectors of the job market are emerging. One of the things I did when I worked for President Obama is I worked with LinkedIn to look at their enormous database. What are the new types of jobs that workers are moving to? What types of jobs are they moving from? To get a sense of how the job market was evolving. It's very likely, in my mind, that we're going to see continued growth of freelancing, digital matching labor markets in the future. I think traditional jobs will be with us, where people have 9-to-5 jobs working for one employer who actually pays them directly. I think there are many advantages to that type of a working relationship, but I think that the share of workers in that type of relationship will continue to shrink. There are many benefits from having non-traditional job opportunities. If you talk to Uber drivers, they'll tell you that, well, if their hours were cut back or they had a few free hours here, they'll turn on the app and they'll work. It provides flexibility. It could provide a cushion for them if they have shocks to their income from other sources. For the economy overall, this means that we can better use our resources. I'll show you the efficiency of Uber compared to traditional taxis towards the end of my talk. But as I mentioned earlier, I think there are some real worries that the growth of non-traditional work arrangements can threaten the social compact that took us a century to build up. The labor protections that we have, the benefits that traditional workers receive. I also worry that this group of, I'll call them independent workers, they're not attached to a particular firm, they're independent contractors in a legal sense, they're detached from the safety net that our employment relationship provides. Unemployment insurance, for example. Independent contractors typically don't qualify for unemployment insurance. They're detached from employer-provided training opportunities. They're responsible for getting their own training. And they're detached from supportive work communities. I think that's a concern. Okay, so let me tell you about this survey that we did. Professor Katz and I surveyed 3,844 workers nationally, and we tried to replicate the current population survey's contingent worker survey, which I mentioned is our main source of the number of workers in non-traditional employment. The category that the BLS measures are freelancers, temporary help, on-call workers. To me, that's a little peculiar. These are not necessarily great jobs, but it's different than being an independent contractor. On-call worker is someone who does not have set hours. And every week or every day, they're told, we have this many hours. Come in during these hours. Don't come in during these hours. You know, interestingly, some jobs used to be on-call or no longer on-call. If you were a dock worker and your job was to unload the boats when they came in, historically, you were on call. Didn't know when the boats would come in. You'd have to call the workers in. And that was also, you know, dangerous, difficult work. Now, with cranes and container ships and communication, those jobs, which there are many fewer of them, are also much better jobs. But those are on-call workers and then contract workers, which I mentioned earlier. And we developed our own set of questions to ask about the gig economy, because 10 years ago, the Bureau of Labor Statistics didn't have this on their radar screen when they did the contingent worker survey. So how do we ask about that? We said, do you provide labor services to customers through an online intermediary, such as Uber or TaskRabbit? That was our technique. And this was kind of our goal when we started this project. What we found was only 0.5% of workers in any given week are providing services directly to customers through an online intermediary. 750,000 workers. Now, it's probably higher now than it was then, because some other studies have found it's been almost doubling every year, but still pretty small. Smaller than the number of workers I mentioned before who are working through an offline intermediary such as Avon. To our surprise, what we found is that these other forms of non-traditional employment are growing very rapidly and are really a bigger story when it comes to the labor force overall. This slide is from a graph that the Wall Street Journal produced based on our study. And the Wall Street Journal must have a big graph budget because they made a much better graph than me, so I reproduced it here. Yellow shows you the share of workers who are self-employed as independent contractors. It's a pretty broad category: freelance workers, independent consultants. And you can see from 1995, that grew from 6.3% of the workforce to 6.9% in 2005, and then 8.4% in 2015. The Wall Street Journal kept saying to me, where do we put the gig workers? Where do we put the gig workers in your charts? So I said, well, they are technically independent contractors, so they shaded them in. And that's the shading in the top of the third yellow bar there. Green shows you the number of workers who are working for contract firms, contract employees. It encompasses a wide range of occupations. And initially, the common jobs for contract workers were cafeteria workers, janitorial workers. It has spread, and I'll show you something on this, up the occupational distribution. Those two categories, you see pretty rapid growth. Now, contract workers only represent now 3% of the workforce, but that's doubled from 10 years ago. And job growth over this decade, from 2005 to 2015, wasn't that great. It was only about 10 million jobs. Those two categories account for 60% of the job growth. And then if you add the other categories of independent contract, of alternative work arrangements, temporary help and on-call workers, they account for 94% of job growth over the last decade. Now, one factor undoubtedly was the Great Recession, and a large number of traditional jobs were eliminated during the Great Recession. But as best we can tell, these trends predated the Great Recession. We could look at contract firms. Contract firms were growing before 2007. Data on self-employment, even here you could see there was growth from 1995 to 2005, and I'll show you some tax data in a moment. So I don't think this was driven by the Great Recession. There are certainly many workers who found themselves displaced during the recession, tried to find a traditional job, after a while became frustrated that they couldn't find a traditional job and turned to self-employment. I call them involuntarily self-employed. It doesn't look like there were enough of them to account for the trends that we're seeing. Now, I also want to emphasize measuring these alternative work arrangements is really difficult, in that many workers are confused about the type of status they have. Suppose that you work for Xerox as a draftsman, and you've been working there for 20 years, and then Xerox contracts out the draftsman, which has happened. Now you're doing the same work, you're sitting in the same chair, you're responding to the same manager, but you're an employee of the contract firm. How do you report yourself? Or you could be self-employed doing the same work you were doing before. Many workers seem to be confused, and the reason why I say that is this chart shows you, based on IRS data, the share of workers who are reporting income on Schedule C. You know, you should have just filed your income taxes a week ago. The students probably don't have to worry about this so much. But, you know, taxes were due April 18th, and if you have self-employment income, that's supposed to be reported on Schedule C of the tax form. IRS has found pretty rapid growth in the share of tax filers filing Schedule C forms. But in the current population survey, every month workers are asked, are you self-employed? And you can see that's actually edged down since the late 1970s. So we have these divergent trends. I'm involved in a study right now where I'm asking workers in two different ways about whether they're self-employed. I'm randomly selecting workers who get question A or question B, and I find a difference of about 7% reporting self-employed, depending upon how I phrase the question. Where have we seen growth in non-traditional work? The growth has occurred particularly for older workers, and especially for freelancers. You see that here. This shows you by age category. On the left, 16 to 24, 25 to 54, and then my group, 55 to 75. And the group that displays the most rapid rise in alternative work arrangements are the older workers, and that's driven by freelancers. That's driven by those who are self-employed independent contractors. Interestingly, you don't see that much growth for the 16 to 24-year-olds, for the young group. And there was a lot of concern during the recession that young people couldn't find good jobs. But young people tend not to have the skills to become independent contractors. It requires networks in the job market to find customers. It requires some business experience often. I don't think it's a bad idea for young people to think about starting a business and being self-employed depending upon their circumstances. But the big growth in alternative work arrangements, even if you look at temporary help, was not among young people. We saw growth for whites, blacks, Hispanics across all race and ethnic groups. All education groups, we saw a rise in alternative work. We saw more of an increase for women than we did for men over this decade. If you look by industry and occupation, it's really interesting. Some industries had been heavily using alternative work arrangements before 2005. If you look at construction sector, it's not so surprising. Contractors are pretty common in the construction sector. If you look at the business sector, professional business was very high. They were very quick. Former co-head of Goldman Sachs once told me a story that at Goldman Sachs, they looked at their workforce and they concluded that they had very highly paid janitors. Goldman Sachs, is a profitable firm, and they couldn't have such wide disparities in the incomes across different jobs, and their janitors were extremely well paid, and they decided that they should contract out the janitorial service, and this person who was the co-head said, and it made an additional $200,000 for the partners, and I remember Bob Reich, who I was with at the time, said, but what about the janitors? That's an example, and that was in the 90s. That's an example of how some sectors of the economy turned to this earlier than others. What we're seeing now is the less competitive sectors, and I circled education and healthcare, which are more insulated from competition. Not that they have no competition, but they're more insulated. Those sectors are catching up in terms of contracting out, turning to alternative work arrangements. You might even be able to see that as you visit, hospitals or other campuses. Okay. I also looked across the occupational spectrum. Here's a way of thinking about this. What I did was I grouped workers into categories based on their earnings potential. So I looked at their education, at their occupation, at the industry that they work in, and I made a forecast of whether they would fall in the lowest earnings group, the highest earnings group. I put them into 5 bins, quintiles, based on their characteristics. And this shows you independent contractors each year, 95, 2005, 2015. And what you see is 2 things. First of all, independent contractors are actually more common in higher income type jobs. Accountants, lawyers. My dad was a self-employed CPA. Secondly, there has been a parallel shift. So we've seen growth across the board. Still more common among those who have higher earnings potential based on their industry, education, occupation. But it's shifted out. It's risen basically for all groups. If you look at workers at contract firms, there's been much more growth for those in higher paid occupations and higher paid industries, more educated workers. Workers are predicted to do better in the job market. So we're seeing this creep up the occupational distribution. It's moving from janitors and cafeteria workers, who tend to be on the lower paid end, up to lawyers and doctors and public relations people. I hesitate to say professors, but that's also the case when it comes to adjuncts. Now, why is this happening? Here I could give you some explanations. I don't know the most important explanation. Demographics is a factor. Older workers are more likely to be self-employed, and we have more older workers. But that looks like it accounts for just 10% of the growth, so it's a factor, but not the biggest one. Another factor, I think, is the technology, which has reduced transactions costs. What do I mean by that? Ronald Coase, who was a Nobel Prize winner in economics from University of Chicago, was the first to raise the very deep question, why do we have companies? Why do we have firms? Why do companies employ workers? Now, remember, Ronald Coase taught at the University of Chicago, so his presumption was that markets are great. We think markets solve problems, markets allocate resources really well. That's a real strength of our system. Why do we have employees? Why don't we just have a contract over everything? Why doesn't President Saltz contract with individual workers to teach particular classes, hold office hours, grade papers? And the answer that Coase came up with was that there are transactions costs. It's very costly to have to negotiate every one of these contracts, every task. It's better to have a firm be kind of an oasis from the market and to be able to use command and control. That's a more efficient arrangement for everyone. So it's in the workers' interests and it's in the company's interest. That was Coase's explanation. Oliver Williamson, another Nobel Prize winner from UC Berkeley, had a different explanation. He actually had two. One explanation was if it's an arm's length contract, it's really hard to supervise the workers and to monitor them. And if things aren't going well, to tell other people about their reputation. But if you have a long-term relationship with the workers, you could solve that problem. You hold the reputational information yourself. So that was one of his explanations. Another explanation he had was that if companies are all kind of different and you're learning different tasks at different companies, so for example, suppose you just go back 20 years when there were 100 different word processing languages. I remember I wrote my dissertation using Xywrite. I'm sure it doesn't exist anymore. I had to learn to use Xywrite. It was kind of costly to learn Xywrite. And if I make that big investment on the expectation that, well, I'll get a reward for learning Xywrite from my employer, but if my employer is the only one who uses Xywrite, then he could say, well, remember that raise I was going to give you for learning Xywrite? Sorry about that. I'm not going to give you that raise, but Xywrite's not going to help you anywhere else, so you might as well keep working for me. He called that the hold-up problem. You could hold up the workers once they made this investment. All of these things have changed because of technology. Transaction costs. Well, you leave an Uber car, the transactions are seamless. You just close the door and your credit card is immediately billed. Or reputation, you could give your driver a certain number of stars, or you could do the same thing on TaskRabbit. The information gets widely shared about the driver or worker's reputation. And technology has become more standardized. Everybody uses Microsoft Office. So you could plug and play workers. You could hire someone for a discrete task and you don't have to worry about training them to use Word or to use Excel. They learn that, in college. And they're learning the same types of skills. So work has become more of a commodity, which makes it easier for it to become outsourced and to become more of an individual market. That's one set of explanations, which rests on technology, and I think that's played an important role. But a second set of explanations is less generous, more nefarious, and I attribute David Weil as the main proponent of this idea. David Weil is a professor at Boston University, and until recently he was the administrator of the Wage and Hour Division at the Labor Department. Weil wrote a book called The Fissured Workplace, where his idea is that companies are fissuring. They're cutting out parts of their activities. They're outsourcing parts of their activities because one could argue they were overpaying for those jobs, or one could argue that they were sharing their rents broadly, they were inclusive, and when inequality increased in the US, Goldman Sachs concluded that they were being too generous to their janitors, so they cut out that activity. Even though they still were doing what employees do, and in Weil's view, technically they should be classified as employees, if they're outsourced, put in a separate firm, then their reference group is not how much the CEO of Goldman Sachs is paid, so they feel like they should be sharing in the profitability of the firm. Their reference group is the outsourced firm, the contract firm. So it enabled the companies to reduce their costs. Another explanation, and I think this particularly applies to manufacturing, is companies face a lot of volatility. They have shocks. Demand is high, demand is low. Difficult to manage in a situation where you have volatility. And what companies discovered was that they could keep a core group of workers who do the most central tasks and reduce volatility by keeping that core subset of workers and adjust on other margins. So reach to the outside market if they have an increase in demand or lay people off, but by doing it through the outsourcing firm as opposed to through their core employees. Interestingly, when Abraham and Taylor did their work, they focused on manufacturing, and there was a presumption that contract workers were more common in manufacturing than other sectors. And it turns out that's not true. They're actually quite prevalent, more prevalent in sectors outside of manufacturing. Then the final explanation, which is really the first one that we thought of, is maybe this is a legacy of the Great Recession. But Larry Katz and I found very little evidence of that. We looked particularly at older workers. If they became displaced during the Great Recession, how much more likely were they to turn to alternative work arrangements? And by our calculations, that could account for about 10% of the rise that we've seen. So there's still a big part of the puzzle. If you take demographics and the Great Recession into account, we explain at most 20% of what's going on. So let me shift to talk about the gig economy. And the rise of the gig economy has generated a huge amount of interest in this area. I can't tell you how many conferences I get invited to on the gig economy. And I think it is out of proportion to its impact on the economy right now, although it is growing rapidly. And these are very early days for the gig economy. Actually, out of curiosity, raise your hand if you've taken a ride in Uber or Lyft or some other ride sharing. Most of you. US-wide, only 15% of Americans have said they've used a ride-hailing app. It tends to be very coastal, East Coast and the West Coast. That's the most common of all of these online activities, sharing economy activities. That's the most common involving labor services. 11% have used home sharing services like Airbnb. The next down here in terms of employment is ordering deliveries, groceries to be delivered or food to be delivered. And I think that's the next sector to be disrupted, like Uber. Hiring someone online to do an errand for you, that's what TaskRabbit does. My daughter just moved to a new apartment. She hired someone on TaskRabbit to move her. She was extremely happy with the situation. Only 4% of Americans have done that. something I haven't done, and I kind of study this area. I didn't realize you could do this, by the way. My daughter also did this. You can rent clothes online. She was going to like a dance, and she ordered 2 dresses. She wore one of them, and then she sent them back. Just some advice to the students. Here's another indication of how early it is. The Pew Research Center asked in the survey I've been talking about whether Americans know what crowdsourcing means. Do they know what the sharing economy means or gig work? Only 11% said they understood what gig work means. So I think we're really on the beginning of this development. And I think it also suggests that when I talk about this topic, I need to be clear about what I mean. So let me describe some of the research I've done on Uber. And I worked with the head of research at Uber, Jonathan Hall, for the last couple of years to study the labor market for Uber drivers. This shows you the number of Uber drivers who are actively providing trips any given month in the US from 2012 until the end of 2015. And you could see this remarkably rapid growth. The purple line is the number of searches on Google for the term Uber, but that's moving up in tandem. But if you look at the green line, that's the number of drivers. And there are now over 400,000 drivers. Over this period, Uber doubled the number of drivers it had every 6 months. If that trend continues for another 5 years, every American will be an Uber driver. So it's destined to slow down. This exponential growth can't go. Moore's law can't hold for Uber drivers. But it just shows the truly remarkable growth that the company has experienced. And the growth has occurred with UberX, not Uber Black. UberX is the low entry, lower cost service. Uber Black is typically a licensed driver, commercially licensed driver. Much of Europe has outlawed UberX, and they only allow Uber Black. So in Paris, you could get Uber. It's a commercially licensed driver. It's the equivalent of Uber Black in the US. There are more Uber drivers in New York than there are in all of France. So I don't think they're going to experience this type of exponential growth unless they permit this lower cost entry. Where do the Uber drivers come from? 61% of them have a full-time job or a part-time job apart from driving for Uber. They vary their hours considerably from week to week. I wanted to characterize what a schedule was like for an Uber driver. There is no schedule. 65% of the drivers either drive 25% more or 25% less from one week to the next. And this is just looking at the drivers who drove in 2 consecutive weeks. Many of them are doing it on a very part-time basis. 51% are working 15 hours or fewer a week. So there are some who are doing it full-time. They're accounting for a bigger share, naturally, of trips. But in terms of the 400,000 drivers, many are doing it on a very short-term basis. Many of the drivers, 85%, said the flexibility of driving for Uber was an appealing aspect of it. We've done a lot of work looking at the typical earnings that drivers make after subtracting Uber's commission and making an estimate of what their expenses are. And it looks like their hourly earnings, net of depreciation, gasoline, the commission that Uber takes out, is pretty close to what taxi drivers make US-wide. Now, if you've taken Uber, you probably noticed that it's a lot cheaper than taxis, which makes you wonder, how can it be so much cheaper than taxi if the drivers are getting paid about the same, earning about the same? And the answer is the drivers are busier while they're working. So I've looked at this lots of different ways. I've looked at the fraction of time that taxi drivers were driving that they had a passenger in the car, the fraction of time that Uber drivers were driving with the passenger in the car. I was able to do that for some cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles. This looks at the fraction of miles that a driver is driving with a passenger in the car. So if you look at Los Angeles, those are the bars to the left. 40% of the miles that a taxi driver is driving, he or she has a passenger in the back seat of the car. 60% of the time they're driving to get somebody, or they're driving around trying to hope somebody flags them down. If you look at Uber, 64% of the miles they drive, they have a passenger in the car. 36% of the time they're empty. To put this another way, for every mile that an LA taxi driver drives with the passenger in the car, he drives 1.5 miles with the car empty. For every mile that an Uber driver drives with the passenger in the car, he's driving 0.5 mile with the car empty. So it's a much more efficient model. Now, why is it more efficient? I think there are actually 3 important reasons why it's more efficient. The first and most obvious is the app. If you've used Uber or Lyft, the app is great. You can see the closest driver, it matches the driver to you. Also, Uber has a lot of drivers, so there's likely to be one who's close to you. So the technology is one. But that's not necessarily the main reason. I think it's an important one. Second reason is the labor market model. When I looked, I couldn't do it for Los Angeles, but I could do it for San Francisco. By hour of day, during the peak hours, taxi and Uber were pretty similar in terms of capacity utilization rate, in terms of the fraction of time they were driving a passenger around. But that was only during a few hours of the day. If you look at off-peak hours, Uber still had pretty high efficiency, not too different than it was during the peak hours, and efficiency was extremely low for taxis. And I think the reason is that the model is totally different for taxis. Taxi drivers tend to lease a car for a shift, an 8-hour shift or a 12-hour shift. They use the car that whole period, whether it's a high demand or a low demand period. With Uber, the drivers are flowing in and out. During low demand periods, the drivers aren't driving. So that means that the resources are being used more efficiently. And then there's a third reason, which is some of the regulation for taxis, which Uber disregards, can be very inefficient. I was in Washington yesterday. Arlington is right across the river from Washington. The Arlington taxis are red, the Washington taxis are yellow or green. If an Arlington taxi comes to drop somebody off in Washington, they're not allowed to pick someone up in Washington and go back to Arlington. So the regulation requires them to go back empty. Same thing in Princeton. If I take the train to Princeton Junction, which is in West Windsor, New Jersey, the taxi takes me to campus, it's not allowed to pick up a student and turn around and go back to West Windsor. So the taxi regulation tends to be inefficient. I think those are the 3 main factors that cause Uber to be more efficient. And I think this shows you the potential for the economy. You know, if you've ever driven in LA, most of the time you're sitting in traffic. But if we can make the traffic more efficient, that could be to everyone's benefit. And of course, think about the impact on the climate and the use of fossil fuel. What about the effects on the traditional economy? Well, we don't know too much yet. The best study was done by a graduate student of mine named Judd Kramer, who's now teaching at Harvard. And he looked at the impact of Uber entering different cities at different times across the country on wages and employment of taxi drivers. And the effect is really quite complicated if you think about it, because what Uber has done is to increase the demand for workers with a moderate level of skills, for workers who can drive, and many might not qualify, who can drive, follow directions, and provide these services to their passengers. And the U.S. economy has been losing a lot of those types of jobs. So that's one impact. Another impact, however, is that the workers have relatively little bargaining power, and it could put downward pressure on labor standards in other sectors. Now, I think taxi is a bit unique, since most taxi drivers are independent contractors, like Uber drivers who don't have benefits and are not receiving particularly generous compensation. So what Judd Kramer found was that taxi medallions fell. A medallion is a license to operate a taxi. In some cities like New York, a medallion used to cost $1 million or more. Now it costs $600,000. The owners of the medallions took a big capital loss. They tended to be the taxi companies. The workers themselves didn't look like they were adversely affected. The number of taxi jobs declined, but their wages didn't. And if you add in the number of hours spent driving for Uber, total number of driver hours increased. So, one lesson I take from this is that we want to get the benefit of the innovations. We want to use policy to shape the impact of the innovations and to cushion the effects on those who might get displaced by the growth in the gig economy. And let me conclude by briefly talking about a proposal I have with Seth Harris, who was Deputy Secretary of Labor, is a labor lawyer. What we argued is that we should extend parts of the social compact that currently affect traditional employees to workers in the gig economy. And we should apply the parts that make sense. And I think of this as leveling up, raising the standards in the gig economy. First, we define this sector, which falls in the gray area of the law right now. There are a lot of lawsuits taking place as to whether Uber drivers are employees or independent contractors. Uber tends to win more than they lose in these cases, but the law, in my opinion, really is ambiguous. So we say workers who can choose when they work, whether they work, who use their own equipment like their own car, who work through an intermediary, and the intermediary exerts less control than it does for a traditional employee. For example, the intermediary doesn't say, show up at such and such hour, don't take a break, drive in this section of town. But the intermediary does exert some control. For example, sets the fee. We would create a new legal category for these workers. We call them independent workers. And we have a set of principles that the protections and legal benefits for independent workers should be appropriate for workers who can choose their own hours. And critically, they control their own hours. So if you're an Uber driver, you can also be a Lyft driver at the same time, or you could be studying for an exam, or watching your children, driving to pick up your children, doing personal tasks while you're working with the app on. Conceptually, I think it's very difficult to say that they're working for a particular employer, since they could be working for many platforms at the same time or doing personal tasks. The irony here is that hours are very well measured by the app, but they're not easy to attribute to a particular employer. So we propose that we extend benefits and protections that are economically efficient, appropriate for these workers, and would be neutral for a firm with respect to choosing traditional employee status versus making their workers independent workers. So what does that entail? Well, we have a whole long proposal on this, but we would extend civil rights protections to these workers. Currently, if you're an independent contractor, you're not protected by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's not illegal for customers to discriminate against you based on your sex, for example, or based on religion. There are some protections based on race, but they're not as strong as they are in the Civil Rights Act. So we would extend Title VII protection under the Civil Rights Act to these workers. We would give these workers the right to organize if they want. Currently, if you're an independent contractor, you're an independent business person. If you get together with other independent businesses to negotiate, that's a restraint of trade. That's a Sherman antitrust law violation. So we would make it clear that they could organize. We would require the intermediary to make a contribution to Social Security, contribution to health insurance. The intermediary could free ride right now because the workers are getting health insurance through the exchange or from a family member's employer. And we would have portable benefits. So if workers contribute to a pension, they could take it with them after they leave. That's the good stuff. The part that got us into trouble was what we thought was not appropriate under our principles for workers in this situation, overtime protection. If you're a traditional employee and you work over 40 hours a week, you get paid time and a half for those extra hours. Well, workers that get to choose their own hours, in our view, didn't need overtime protection. They're not being required to work more than 40 hours a week. They can control their own hours. Unemployment insurance, very tricky, but it's very difficult to decide whether someone is unemployed if they're an independent contractor. They're choosing when to work, whether to work. Maybe there's some other type of arrangement to help them, rainy day fund if they have slack demand. And then the other benefit that we had in mind was minimum wage. I'm actually unusual for an economist, a big fan of the minimum wage. I don't think it's appropriate for workers whose hours can't easily be ascribed to a particular employer. Seth Harris and I think we're way ahead of our time because we presented this proposal at a Brookings conference, and Senator Mark Warner was our discussant. Senator Warner has been one of the leaders in the Senate in looking at these issues. He's been a big supporter of portable benefits for independent workers. And he said Seth and Alan had a great proposal. They have a perfect compromise. They got the trade-offs exactly right, and they managed to piss off everyone because the sides aren't ready to compromise yet. So I was hoping we might kind of be at the beginning of a grand bargain, like we had a century ago for workers' compensation insurance, but I think that the process has not reached the point where it's become apparent that the current system is very inefficient. So why don't I stop there? I'm continuing to do work in this area. I'm thinking about policy for independent workers more generally, not only those who are working through an intermediary. But why don't I stop there, and hopefully I left some time for questions. Don't be shy. I couldn't have been so clear that you have no questions. Please.
Do you believe that with the rise of self-autonomous cars with Google and other companies like that, that will
Can you talk closer to the mic?
Do you believe with the rise of self-autonomous cars and companies like Google, will that hurt companies like Uber and Lyft?
Yeah. Yes. Oh, great question. Autonomous cars on the rise. Not necessarily will it hurt Uber or Lyft. I think the impact will be more on drivers in general. Uber in particular is investing considerable sums in developing the technology for driverless cars. I think that is a truly disruptive technology. I think particularly for trucks it's going to be disruptive as well. It is an example of the types of technological change that ultimately we need, but we have to help manage. And I think we have to make sure that it's safe, first and foremost. Now, with so many Americans, we have 10,000 Americans turning age 65 a day, given the size of the baby boom cohort, and that's going to go on for another 15 years. With older drivers, we might be a lot safer with autonomous driverless cars. And then we have to think about how do we help the truck drivers, the taxi drivers, the limo drivers, the Uber drivers who have been relying on that type of work for income to make a transition to other sectors. But in the long run, it's innovations that allow us to produce more using less labor that lead to higher living standards. Yes? I'm sorry, the rise of? I think taxi was really ripe for disruption in that they tended to be pretty inefficient monopolies. In the US, the rents from those monopolies went to the companies. In Europe, the rents go to the taxi drivers. So in Europe, the taxi drivers own the medallions. And one of the reasons why I think politically it's been difficult for Uber to make much headway in Europe is that the taxi drivers are a much more sympathetic group than the companies that restricted the number of medallions, lobbied to keep restrictions on the number of medallions, carved up the territories to make it inefficient, so you can only drop off in certain jurisdictions and so on. So I think we had a sector which was not on the frontier, was very inefficient, was ripe for disruption. And I don't think it will totally disappear because I think taxis serve a certain purpose which Uber doesn't serve. They provide a level of certainty, perhaps, that Uber doesn't provide. But I think taxi will become more like limo services, and will cater to a different clientele. And the numbers are roughly, as I recall, and it's a little bit out of date, but in Los Angeles, the number of taxi drivers fell by, say, 20–25% because of Uber, and Uber, say, made up 45%. So the total number of trips went, say, up 30% overall. But taxis are still there. On the other hand, Uber is still expanding there. Yes? Right. That's a really good question. They require a certain amount of density. And one of the reasons why I think Uber has been so successful is scale. I'd like to point this out. In San Francisco, there are 5 taxi companies. Combined, they're the same size as Uber. But if you call up one company, there's a lower chance that that company has a cab near you than Uber has. So Uber will arrive sooner just because of its scale. So I think it does benefit a lot from scale. The way that Uber's financial model works, if they expand to more markets, they make more money. They prioritize the high population centers. And if it's not Uber that goes to less dense populations, it would be Lyft or one of the competitors. So I expect that it probably will spread. It'll probably take more time. I don't think you'll see the kind of exponential growth. But there are some advantages. I'll tell you, Princeton is not particularly urban. And if you call a taxi, sometimes it comes, sometimes it doesn't come. And if you want a taxi to go to the airport, you really want the taxi to come. With the Uber app, it's terrific. You can see where the car is. And if you're not happy with the car, you can get another one. So it's much easier for the customer to monitor, which I think is an advantage in more remote areas. Yes? Yes. Right. Yes. That's a great question. President Obama asked me the exact same thing. He said, you go into CVS and you don't see any workers. You check yourself out. Amazon, same thing. Amazon, I think, is trying to develop the technology. You just walk out, it knows who you are, and it bills you. And I think it is the case that e-commerce has been cutting into traditional retail businesses. If you look at shopping malls, there are far more vacancies now in shopping malls than there used to be. And if you're a real estate developer, it's probably not a winning proposition to develop more shopping malls. In terms of employment, however, it's very interesting because employment in warehouses and in package delivery has soared at the same time that it has declined in retail and roughly offset. So I think that's an example of how we reallocate labor and we come up with new ideas for deploying labor. What President Obama was worried about is the same issue you raised, is he said, this is different. The technology that led people to leave the farms and go to the cities and work in manufacturing, and then led them to leave manufacturing, go to services. Now it's the services that are being disrupted. And I don't know if anyone bought the Amazon Alexa device. It's an incredible gadget. You know, you talk to it and you say, play me Bruce Springsteen, Glory Road, and it plays Glory Road. You say, what's the weather like outside? It tells you the weather. The artificial intelligence is truly remarkable. And apparently 15% of the interactions on Amazon's Alexa are not about, they're personal. They're like, Alexa, how do you feel today? Alexa, I'm really happy to talk to you this morning. Which is kind of amazing, and it says something, I think, about a lot of Americans are isolated and lonely. But what President Obama was worried about is that this new technology is going to be different because it could replace the service sector. It could replace jobs in the service sector. Now, I don't know if it's all that different. I mean, it used to be 95% of Americans worked in agriculture, and they were self-employed. So in a way, we're kind of going back to where we were. So we've managed transitions before. What I think you can make a reasonable bet on is that there'll be more personal services in the future, things that can't easily be replaced. So you know, healthcare sector is obvious, but home nurses. And if that gets disrupted by robots over time, there would be something else. I would expect. And there's a big debate about that, but every prediction in the past that we'll have a jobless future and everyone will be unemployed has been wrong. It has affected the distribution of income. I think there's no question that technological change has made it harder for people to make a middle-class living. To my mind, that's an issue of public policy. How do we help redistribute or make sure we provide opportunities so there's a more level playing field when it comes to obtaining skills so people can take advantage of the opportunities in the new economy. But in terms of number of jobs, it has not, I don't think it's been a problem. And I have been asked this question throughout my career. And, you know, over that period, we've added 50 million jobs. So for the US, we have a flexible enough economy that we come up with new uses for human labor. Yes? Access to. Right. Right. That's a good question. So, you know, I believe in the idea of a progressive income tax system. I think those who are fortunate and have succeeded should be expected to contribute more. I think their success is in part a result of society as a whole. It's in part a result of luck. It's in part a result of investments that have been made in the past. You know, if you think, I often think about the tremendous wealth that Silicon Valley executives have made, and you know, think about the role of someone like John von Neumann, who was a mathematician who invented the first working computer. You know, he didn't get any of that benefit. And had he not done that, Mark Zuckerberg wouldn't be Mark Zuckerberg. So I don't understand why there's so much opposition to having an estate tax. You know, Donald Trump ran on eliminating the estate tax. Most Americans don't pay the estate tax. In order to pay the estate tax, your estate needs to have more than $11 million. You know, most Americans would like to have that problem. I have a lot of respect for Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and others who signed the pledge that they're going to give away most of the wealth that they accumulated. In fact, what Buffett did is truly remarkable. Buffett said, I'm not so good at giving away money. That's not my comparative advantage. My comparative advantage is making money, so I'm going to give it to Gates to give away. Gates is good at that. He's got a good family. I mean, that's kind of remarkable. So I worry a lot about the polarization in our society and the difficulty that children from disadvantaged circumstances have getting quality education, getting the same kinds of chance that, frankly, my children have had. And I worry that that's going to get much harder, and I think that's a recipe for problems down the road. I was asked at lunch about globalization and trade, and I think having an open trading system, being part of the world trading system, increases the size of our pie, but it does create winners and losers. Now, I don't think that globalization is the main driving force behind the growth and inequality we've seen, but it's become extremely difficult to reach political consensus to support NAFTA, which we had for the last 25 years during good times and bad times. And NAFTA was signed in 1994. The U.S. economy boomed. I mean, inequality fell in the late 90s. That's the only time in the last 35 years where inequality fell. But I think our politics are much more difficult. Our society is much more polarized because of the rising inequality. And I think the rising inequality reduces equality of opportunity. And I think that's a bedrock principle of the U.S. The American dream is that everyone has an opportunity to succeed. There's a paper that was published in Science on Sunday night. I had a comment on it, which found that if you look at children born in the late 1940s, over 90% of them earned more than their parents did. If you look at them at the same age, look at them at, say, age 30. If you look at children born 1984 and 1985 who are around age 30 today, only half earn more than their parents. So we've had this enormous decline in social mobility, and it's driven by the rise in inequality. It's not driven by slower economic growth. It's been driven by the fact that the growth that we've had has occurred in the extremes, in the top few percent of the income distribution. So I think we need to redouble our efforts to provide access to high quality education, childcare, preschool education, healthcare, particularly for those who are unlucky and their parents are struggling in the economy. And I think that would make us a stronger economy, a stronger country.
I'm Jim Brown. I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and I just wanted to acknowledge the efforts of Kruger again, and to acknowledge the efforts of the Department of Economics and particularly Dr. Mehdi Haririan for putting this together. As I was listening to the talk, I was thinking, my grandfather, this is a Pennsylvania story, some of you will recognize this. My grandfather was a steel worker, and he worked at the same plant his entire adult life, and he received a defined benefit pension as a result of that. It's a very archaic idea. Well, I'm not an economist, okay? My father was a steel worker who worked for a series of positions in the same industry throughout his life. I was a steel worker who worked for 9 months in the steel industry before the plant where I worked closed, and I had the opportunity to explore graduate education. And that's what you all are looking at is, as you enter the workforce, is a very challenging landscape, and liberal education, of course I'm going to beat this particular drum, but liberal education, it seems to me, is the one imaginable preparation for the landscape that you're facing to be successful in this. And I'm not talking about a liberal arts education that one college at this university offers. I'm talking about the philosophy of liberal education that infuses every one of our programs, whether you're an education major, a biology major, a finance major, or an art major, okay? That's that broad base, and nowhere more are you going to see that than in the kinds of knowledge and the kinds of processing that took place in Dr. Kruger's talk. And with that, I will thank you for attending. Again, thank you, Dr. Kruger. Let's give him one more round of applause.
Thank you for all of you that you come and good questions. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.